fade out, Paddy Cole there. And because I have a tape interview, I did it a few days ago, and it's pretty long, and I have to time it very accurately if I'm going to fit it in at the different parts of the programme this morning. So after the commercial break, just straight away, you'll hear our first contributor to the programme. She's Anne Berkery, daughter of Maura and the late Frank Berkery of Doon. Anne was a very interesting person to meet. She's a nurse by profession, but that's not the aspect of her life you're going to hear. I persuaded her to tell me about her travels around the world. Persuaded being the operative word. We'll just say she was a slightly reluctant interviewee. Well, we'll take the commercial break and then you'll hear what it's all about. Now I'm going to tell you about the interview that I did with Anne Berkery and give you the background. Anne travelled far and wide in the last 8 months, and her travels began in Africa, taking in Madagascar, South Africa, Namibia and Botswana. She then flew to Bangkok in Asia, there travelling to Thailand, Malaysia, Burma, Vietnam and China. And she spent 6 weeks in Tibet, and the last day was in Nepal. So we'll get the general flavour of what happened to Anne in her travels in the Far East.
I'd met up with a few travellers, went on safari in South Africa and met up with 10 other people. And in Vietnam, I bought a motorbike with a Dutch guy and we travelled for 2 months together. And apart from that, I was on my own. It was like a step back in time. Just arrived in Main Street, Rangoon, to see everybody, first of all, dressed alike, men and women, wearing long safari-type dresses, everybody on bicycles. At the time I was there, it was rainy season in Rangoon, so it was really, really hot and humid, and with very heavy rains in the afternoon.
And how did the people earn their living there?
Mainly rice growing and exporting teak wood. So they have a lot of employment in the forestries. The rice growing.
Were they happy-looking people, Anne?
Yes, they were very happy. These people are very religious, very devout people. Their religion is Buddhism.
Yeah.
About 60% of the population are Buddhist monks, both male and female. The countryside is just dotted with thousands of pagodas and temples dating back to 13th, 14th century. So lavish and gold-studded. One particular Buddha that I saw, he weighed 6.5 ton, and 2.5 ton of this was 24 karat gold.
And this would be a Buddha god?
Yes, one of their gods that they worship. Their money, any spare money that they have, they give to their monasteries and to the upkeep of their temples. It's very prestigious for a family to have a monk, either a boy or a girl in the family. The children must study at least 2 years in a monastery before the age of 6.
Is that what you said, before the age of 6? For a boy or a girl, they'd have to be sent away to one of these monasteries for 2 years to get the foundation of the Buddhist religion. Is that it?
Yes, they have so much to learn with regard to their religion that they must spend at least 2 years at this very young age, where they go and dress entirely, and the boys in purple, the girls in pink, and they must have their hair shaven. And they spend 2 years away from their family. And also during the teenage years, they spend another year or 2 years. And by the time they reach 20, at least 60% of the population remain within the monastery life.
So you were there now, and you were surrounded with all these temples and pagodas, and where did you stay while you were in this country?
Many of the towns have hotels readily available for the tourists, special tourist hotels, but I also spent some nights in the monasteries with the nuns. This was arranged for me by a Burmese guy that I met in Rangoon, but this wouldn't be approved of by the authorities. I should have actually stayed in hotels there.
They wouldn't like to have tourists become that close to their kind of inner sanctum and their approach to life, is it?
Maybe that is one reason, but another is because they don't want to lose out on your money. They like you to stay in the tourist board hotels so that the government receives the money.
What other country fascinated you?
Well, Vietnam. Vietnam was a dream come true for me.
Had you read about these countries much, or had you heard about it, or met people that had been there?
Yes, well, with Vietnam, I had read a lot with regard to the history and the war. Thanks to Vietnam, I had a real fascination with this country. I had read much about its war history, etc. And
did the place live up to your expectations?
it did and it didn't.
Well, what did you find fascinating about Vietnam?
The reminders of the war remaining in Vietnam. The Americans pulled out in the middle 70s, I think 1975, and today there's many
Craters?
there's bomb craters visible, especially in the center of the country. There's tanks, army tanks, just left lying around in the rice paddies, in the fields at the back of people's houses. One hotel I stayed in, woke up in the morning, it was dark when I arrived at the village in the night time, and woke up in the morning, looked out the window, and there was an old airplane lying in the back field. Then there you often see just bombs lying around on the side of the street, on the side of the road. These would be tracks through the mountain in the middle of no place. The big 50-pound bomb was just lying there. There's a huge scrap metal industry there where they're breaking down all the metal left over from the war and probably selling it back to the Americans.
The Vietnamese people strike you?
Very friendly, very accommodating to the tourists. Even if you ask about their feelings towards the Americans, they don't seem to hold any grudges. I think that they have forgotten about the war now, and they're concentrating on building up their economy. A lot of the people speak English. They do seem to have lost their culture in some ways. They wear very Western clothes. The girls wear jeans and shirts, as likewise the boys. Very few wear the traditional dress. Working in banks and official government office workers wear the traditional clothes, but otherwise on the street they just wear jeans and shirts. And of course Coca-Cola is really in, and Lucky Strike cigarettes. And many still have a desire to go and live in the United States. Many of their relatives still live there. There is some tension still between the North and South Vietnam, but mostly the war years have been forgotten.
And what type of transport would they have in Vietnam?
In Vietnam, it's mostly the motorbike and bicycle. Public transport is limited to old, rickety, overcrowded, uncomfortable buses that take hours. The roads are worse than Irish roads. You haven't seen any potholes yet until you have been to Vietnam. And a journey of just 100 kilometers might take 4 hours. So when I decided to travel through Vietnam, I opted to buy a motorbike, and I purchased a Russian motorbike with a Dutch friend of mine, and we drove through the countryside. It took us 2 months to drive from the south to North Vietnam.
How much would the motorbike cost?
It cost brand new $290 American dollars.
And would it be easy to get petrol?
Yes, it's easy to get petrol. In all the villages, you have a lady sets up a little stall, and she sells petrol in litre bottles of Coke or plastic containers, anything that she can find. It's usually black market petrol that she sells, and the price varies from place to place. You have to know the price and bargain down to get the proper rate. Petrol is quite cheap. One day that John and I decided to go and visit an old American battlefield called Eardrum Valley. It was quite a long journey from the main town that we were staying in, about 3 hours through mountain track, bush, just a dirt track road. Before coming to the battlefield area, we had to first get permission from the local police, who had set up a checkpoint on the road, en route. So we came across the police checkpoint, and I decided to let John deal with the policeman, man-to-man talk. And he spent about 1 hour in this little office with a policeman that spoke no English and his 4 or 5 comrades, trying to convince them that we should go that we could have the right to travel this road and visit this area.
And while all this was going on, what were you doing?
I was sitting outside under the shade of the tree, reading my book, writing my diary, just passing the time. I know in Vietnam things take a long time. You have to discuss, first of all, the man's family, then you must tell him that how much you love his country, then you discuss the weather, then you give out cigarettes, everybody smokes cigarettes, and meanwhile you drink 2 or 3 pots of tea. And at the end of maybe 1 hour, hopefully you will get what you want.
So you had gone through this performance a number of times, and on this occasion you decided to leave John do it as man-to-man with policemen.
Exactly. We had very little Vietnamese between us, but we had a phrase book, and with the use of the phrase book and our 5 or 6 Vietnamese words, and with the use of picture drawing, we were able to communicate. John was getting quite tiresome at the end of an hour, and he just said, please can we go, and decided that to try a new line of interest, and told the policeman that we had actually come to see the elephants. Yeah, he had become quite desperate for an excuse, and in Vietnam there are still elephants in the jungle, so it was quite a plausible excuse, at least John thought. So John drew an elephant on a piece of paper and pointing with his little bit of Vietnamese words, saying, "We have come to see the elephants," pointing to the picture he had drawn on the paper. So the policeman takes the piece of paper, studies the elephant, and with his head down starts writing, really intent writing. And John just sat there, and after a few minutes he handed back the paper to John, and underneath the elephant the policeman had written, "Go to the zoo."
So that if they decide they can have their piece of fun at the expense of the tourists and the foreigners.
Funny at the time, because not one word of English had been spoken through the whole interview, and this man had had written perfect English, "Go to the zoo." So they came out of the checkpoint post, and John and the policeman approached me, and John said, "Unfortunately, they're not going to allow us to go." So I just looked at the policeman and I smiled and I said, "Please," in Vietnamese, "we have come all this distance. We would really like to go and see this area." And he said, "Okay."
So the charm of the Irish Colleen won out. Now tell us something about the food that people use in Vietnam and those eastern countries out there.
Well, the food is always readily available. If you ask me, they eat 24 hours a day. They cook their food usually just on the side of the street. They set up shop. They have a little pile of wood, or charcoal, actually. They use charcoal, and they keep it burning continuously, either to heat a saucepan full of fat, and you can buy deep-fried anything, like deep-fried pineapple, deep-fried bananas, deep-fried chicken. You can buy anything.
And what, would they dip it into batter or something?
Yes, dip it into the burning oil.
And then would they put it into batter first and then into the oil?
Yes, they just make up the batter there on the side of the street and dip whatever you choose into the batter, then into the oil, and wrap it up in a piece of newspaper for you. They cook. You can just buy anything. Vegetables, all sorts, a huge variety of vegetables, and the fruit, all the tropical fruits. You don't ever have to go into a restaurant. You can just pick up a meal, vegetable meal, for maybe $1 or less.
And did you ever get any kind of tummy upset?
No, not me. I was very lucky.
So obviously you had a good constitution for your foreign travels. Was it costly to move around from one country to another?
No, in Asia, the cost of living is quite cheap for food and accommodation and public transport. It is really unbelievably cheap. I was spending, on average, $5 a day, which includes everything: accommodation, transport, and food. I tried to cut down on the number of flights and travelled overland from each country. It's the flights that eat up your money. But $5 a day max, which is about £3 a day I was spending.
And when you say that you travelled from overland from one country to another, what was the mode of transport?
Well, to get from Vietnam to China, I just walked across the bridge. But mostly I travelled on buses, the local buses. Trains were a little bit more expensive. But for long journeys, trains were quite good, because you could get a sleeping train, because sometimes you might have to travel a 30-hour trip. So you could have a sleeper and sleep en route, which was really nice.
And I often hear people talking about that you hitch a ride from A to B, but it actually hasn't quite the same meaning when you're out in these countries as it would have here at home.
No, in Asia, most of the Asian countries, you are expected to pay for your ride, so it's more of an official hitch.
Yes.
I hitched a very long trip, about 2,400 kilometers from Chengdu to Lhasa, the provincial capital of Tibet, and this journey took me 2 weeks. I was alone and never felt any way intimidated, never frightened, because there was always other people hitching. There was just no other mode of transport except to hitch, and the rides were on goods trucks, usually sitting on the top of 100 sacks of rice, in the cold, in the wind, and the dust.
And whole families would avail of this type of hitching?
Yes, it's the only way to get from A to B. There are no buses available in Tibet, no trains, and the roads are hazardous. The only transport are trucks.
Now, tell us something about the hotels you stayed in. At least that you wrote home and you told Mother you were staying in hotels. Tell me a bit about them.
Yes, I think she had the idea I was staying in plush accommodation, like Jury's Hotel in Limerick, but it was very, very basic, usually just a hard bed, and always you had to have the mosquito net, of course. Hard bed, just the roof made from banana leaf or latticed, what's it called, latticed bamboo, and very, very basic cement floor, cement wall. You had to provide your own blankets, and you probably had to go for a hike down the back of the field to the toilet, an outside toilet.
Well, listeners, we'll break there because the News in Irish is coming up, and I'll continue the interview I did with Anne Berkery of Doon after the Irish News. I'll be back with it at roughly about 25 to 10 when I have the news and the ads out of the way. Good morning program. Teresa Corish here with you. Before our News in Irish, I gave you part of the interview I did a few days ago with Anne Berkery of Doon. She's daughter of Maura and the late Frank Berkery. And before the early part of it there, she was talking about her impressions of Vietnam. So we'll rejoin her now as she talks about Tibet.
Tibet is another fascinating country. And also very sad when you think of their history. The Tibetan people have been occupied since the mid-50s by the Chinese, and they're oppressing the Tibetan people. They are not allowed to practice their religion and their customs freely, and they're kept down by military law, military rule. So it was very sad from this point of view, but also very interesting to be able to see firsthand the culture that does still remain. No matter how hard the Chinese try, the Tibetan culture still shines through. Also, again, their religion is Buddhist. They have many, many monasteries, beautiful buildings, also dating back to 14th, 15th century. Many of their monasteries are ruins after the invasion and the revolution. The Chinese bombed many of the monasteries. Some of them have been rebuilt to try and satisfy foreign countries
who are in there keeping an eye on the level of persecution. Is that the idea? Yeah.
Yes.
Used to obliterate the native culture of the people.
At the moment, it's apparent that military rule is keeping down the people. Every place you go, every monastery, there are uniformed police keeping the people in check. Many times I stop people and ask them if I could take their photograph, and this always drew a crowd. And sometimes I'm standing in the middle of 20 or 30 Tibetan people, and the police would come up and break the crowd up because...
I know is that any gathering is a possibility for exchange of ideas, and at all costs, this is what they don't want to happen.
All foreigners and tourists to specific areas, you go and see where they want you to see. So in fact you don't get a true understanding of the oppression that the people live under. The road that I travelled from Chengdu to Lhasa is actually a closed road. It's closed to foreigners, and I shouldn't have been there. But for me, it was the most direct route to Lhasa. It would have been the quickest and the cheapest way. My other options would have been to fly, which cost too much money. So I chanced my arm. I was arrested twice. The first time I was arrested, the gift of the gab, I suppose, helped, and my tears. And again, these boys didn't speak much English, and there was lots of sign language. We had to use the phrase book, and I think in the end it was my tears that saved the day. The policeman told me that I had to leave the town the next morning at daybreak, and I had been having trouble getting lifts, and I said, if I don't get a lift, is it all right to stay for 2 nights in your town? And he said, no, if you don't get a lift, you must walk. So I walked for 3 days and covered 100 kilometres. Got blisters on my feet. I was starving. I didn't have any tent or anything with me, but luckily the Tibetan people that I met on the way were very hospitable, and they gave me food and shelter for the 2 nights that I was on the road. Then on my second occasion, it was more official. It was actually the tourist police that arrested me, and they had the English, they had their law books. They told me that I broke section 17 and 29 of the People's Republic of China, and they gave me quite a hefty fine by Chinese standards. By converting the money, it probably came to about £20, which isn't a lot of money, but in China it is quite, I could survive on £20 for 2 weeks. To me it was a lot of money at the time, and I tried to plead poverty and crying again. And they told me that I could hawk my camera to raise the money, but in the end I think they did feel sorry for me, and they offered to buy me my bus ticket to Lhasa. I was only 12 hours away from my destination, and they offered to buy the ticket at the Chinese price for so that I could afford to pay the fine, because as a tourist you usually pay 4 or 5 times more than the local person would pay for both transport and accommodation. So I got off lightly in the end.
So definitely you might say you got an inside track view of the real life in Tibet. Were you put in a prison, or were you brought to a police station?
Yes, they brought me to the police station, and then they confiscated my passport. And from the police station, they designated the hotel that I must stay in, and they collected me the next morning. So it wasn't actually, I didn't feel like a criminal, but they did make me feel as though I had done something wrong, but I knew I had anyway before. I was just hoping I would be able to talk my way out of it, but it didn't work the second time.
Yes. Well, maybe the first police group, maybe the password to the second group. But anyway, you survived it, and you're here to settle the tale. And they didn't confiscate the roll of film and the camera?
No, actually, that is a good point, because most of the area where I had travelled through, it was a military zone, and it was for this reason that they didn't want foreign travellers passing through. They had lots of radars and huge military camps, I would say. There must be, I couldn't even put a figure, but probably 2 million soldiers on this particular road.
What idea did you get of the Tibetan people, apart from your experiences with the policemen?
Yeah, so the policemen would be the Chinese, and as I have said previously, they rule the Tibetan people, which differ very much from the other Asian nationalities that I have encountered. They're quite vivacious people, very outgoing, and I notice this mostly in the ladies. They are not at all shy.
Are they confident, the women?
Yes, they are very confident. In most Asian countries, there doesn't seem to be any discrimination between the sexes, and in fact, the females usually do most of the work, the hard labour. The females are out in the fields, the females plough the land, etc. And this is also true in Tibet. But the ladies seem to be very at ease with both Westerners and the Tibetans, both male and female. They don't have any inhibitions whatsoever. Their way of life is quite amazing. I've heard these people are different. They dress quite amazing. They wear skin fur, animal fur, and skin coats and skin fur boots. they wear many layers because it's so cold, the weather is so cold. They ride into town on their horses. It reminded me of the Wild West, what I would imagine the Wild West to be. They look quite Indian in their appearance. They've got a red tinge to their skin. They wear long hair, both male and female, long and plaited, and they are very different in appearance to the Chinese, and you can see that they are a totally different race. And it's very sad to see the way they are being oppressed by the Chinese. Their true leader is the Dalai Lama, and to this day they still believe this. They still pray to their Dalai Lama, and they consider him both their religious and lawful leader. And the efforts of the communist regime in China isn't, it's very intensive, but it doesn't seem to have made all that inroads into their own native culture. Is that it? They seem a very strong people, and it's going to take a lot more to put them down, I think.
You were coming to the end of your...
We'll take a break there, and I'll go in then to the last part of the interview I did with Anne Berkery of Doon. She'll have reached Nepal, and that was where she spent the last 2 weeks of her Eastern journey. We'll be back with Anne in just a few seconds. Welcome back, Teresa Corish here on the Good Morning programme. We're going to go into the last part of the interview I did a few days ago with Anne Berkery of Doon. Before the break there, you heard her talking about Tibet, and if my memory serves me right, we're now moving into Nepal.
And after Tibet, where did you go to?
Nepal was my last stop. I hitched from Lhasa to Kathmandu, a journey of 5 days.
And this was in trucks and what have you?
Yes, trucks again. I began my last day in Tibet in a village at the base of Mount Everest at 5,400 meters. Dressed, I felt like Michelin Man. I had 4 layers of clothing on my legs, 4 pairs of socks, 7 layers on top, 2 scarves, 2 gloves, a big woolly hat, and wrapped up in a sleeping bag on the back of the truck. By the end of that afternoon, 6 o'clock that evening, I found myself in a village in Nepal at 600 meters above sea level. It was total Tropicana. There was banana trees, palm trees, people walking around in shorts and t-shirts, and I quickly had to strip off each layer.
And that was surely a contrast from one country to another. And how long had you in Nepal?
I spent 2 weeks in Kathmandu. I had to concentrate on recharging my batteries for the final leg of my journey, which was a flight direct to Shannon and home for Christmas with my family.
And was it lovely being home for Christmas?
Yes, it was great to see all my family and friends again.
Well, in 1994, do you plan to return to your nursing?
Not 94, hopefully in 95. I have my sights set on Mexico, Central America and South America for my next trip.
And when do you plan to take off?
Well, I fly to London on Monday next.
So that would be, that's actually the Monday now, the day that this programme is going out, this interview is going out, and this is the day that Anne Berkery will actually be taking off for foreign climes once again. Wait for Anne Berkery to return to Ireland, and then we will have the pleasure of getting an insight into how the one half of the world lives. And how do you feel now that you have completed the interview for Tipperary Midwest?
I could cheerfully kill you, Mrs. Corage.
Well, listeners, wasn't it just a gem that I did succeed and I did persevere in coaxing Anne Berkery to tell us about her travels in the East?
At the center of everything, you and Tipperary Midwest Radio.
Well, our thanks again to Anne Berkery of Doon, daughter of Maura and the late Frank Berkery. And I hope you enjoyed it. We had great fun making it. And as you can well imagine, there was a lot of giggling that went on. And but for all that, isn't it a marvellous souvenir to have of her time in, wait till I read all those countries again. Thailand, Malaysia, Burma, Vietnam, China, Tibet, Nepal, and the early part where we didn't go into the African part of it. But can't you, I'm sure you'll be tuned in, I'd say about a year's time. I'll have her back again and we'll hear all about, where was it, Mexico and Chile and South America. Well, I think an appropriate one now would be Brendan Shine with Lovely Isle of Green, and do hope that...
Hope for that.